In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
So this is part of a series of interviews that will accompany a book I'm writing about building a new kind of economy that will be published by Chelsea Green, an employee-owned company and part of the new economy that the book is describing, built around a mutual credit core. And today I'm talking with Brett Scott, author and specialist in the money system. He wrote this, Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. And I'll put a link to Brett's excellent YouTube channel in the description below, and I'll add links to other things we talk about as well. Hi, Brett.
Hey, Dave. How are you doing? Good to be here.
So first thing, as I understand it, you came to London from South Africa in order to work in the city to find out about how the financial sector operates. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was around 2008. I came from South Africa, got a job in as the financial sector was imploding during the financial crisis, and I essentially broke in. I ended up getting a job at a derivatives brokerage, but just before that I'd been interviewed by Lehman Brothers just weeks before they went bust. So I was kind of like joined the financial sector just as a lot of the kind of the big crisis was hitting. But yeah, it was very explicitly for me, quite an exciting adventure to try and go and break into something which I had traditionally seen as quite, against my values, should I say. And to go and explore it with a kind of open mind. And that's basically what I did for 2 years, which was enough time.
Right. So you didn't go in there to sort of try and bring it down, or you wanted to sort of understand it more.
Well, it'll take more than one person to bring down the financial sector. Anyway.
And what sort of things did you discover?
Well, I mean, there's on the one hand, you learn technical things in the financial sector, and on the other hand, so there's a whole bunch of technical stuff I learned. But I also, probably the most interesting stuff was looking at the social dynamics and the cultural dynamics of the financial sector. Learning the kind of, who the people were, why they'd ended up there, how they sort of saw what they were doing in the economy and that kind of thing. So, and I ended up writing a book about that process.
And were you more enlightened or horrified?
I think I came out of it with a much more kind of, let's say, nuanced view on finance. Prior to that, I'd been quite like sort of activist-y in the way I'd spoken about it, should I say. But I kind of came out with a much more, by default, if you go into a system and you spend time exploring the nuances of who's there and stuff, you're going to come out with a slightly different perspective on how it works, similar to if you're a peace activist and then you go and spend time with military soldiers, you're probably going to realize their backstories. You're going to see where they come from, why they might have come to believe certain things. So I came out with a bit of a kind of like a slightly, maybe a richer perspective on finance. And then from there, I kind of tried to apply a lot of that knowledge to say more alternative forms of finance and so on. But I wasn't really like horrified, if that's the question. Like it was all these systems, like large scale financial systems, are often in some ways they're quite banal. They're quite they're a huge scale bureaucratic systems, corporate systems, and a lot of people who work in them don't really sort of know what they're doing or the broader context of it. So it's quite like the everyday life of the sort of financial sector, or casino capitalism, as it were, doesn't necessarily it's not like the Wolf of Wall Street necessarily portrays it.
And so you left, obviously, and so what drives you now?
Well, actually, quite similar things as what drove me before. I have a sort of, in many ways, a spirit of exploration. which is what often pushes me into systems that I'm exploring. But the exploration is often driven by a desire to find ways to reconnect people to otherwise very alienating systems. So my desire to enter the financial sector was like me trying to like figure out, here's an extremely large alienating system that people find very kind of like spooky and like mysterious and stuff. Let me go and try to like make it more human for myself, as it were, kind of like try to bring it down to earth for myself, and then try and help people understand that by like, writing a book about that and so on. But I still have that impulse nowadays. I'm often trying to figure out entering communities, sort of seeing, what are the intuitive concerns that somebody has, and then how does it like end up, for example, like a current example is like the Bitcoin community. I ideologically have some massive problems with the Bitcoin community, but I will like enter into that space and try to like understand what's going on in people's minds, why they believe certain things about what's going on. So it's quite anthropological, the kind of stuff I'm doing. But the end goal is just try and like help people to sort of reconnect to economic systems that otherwise just seem too big to understand.
I was going to get onto this later on, but you've said it already. So what ideological problems do you have with the Bitcoin community?
Well, I mean, now we can jump into that now if you want. I mean, it's I don't want to derail the trajectory that you were going on, but it's in a nutshell, Bitcoin has an extremely conservative perspective on money, and quite an old school and conventional perspective on money, although framed in a very like supposedly disruptive way, largely because the technology layer of it is very innovative. A lot of people have made this mistake of seeing the fact that the technology element of it is highly innovative. They then jump from that to thinking that the monetary system implemented using Bitcoin is innovative, which it's not. So it's basically a very crude a very crude pseudo money system implemented on a highly advanced technological layer. Yeah, well, not the whole Bitcoin community. Look, there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin community who are sometimes politically progressive, but who don't understand necessarily the dynamics of the thing that they're supporting. So I know actually many kind of like US Democrat liberals, maybe you want to call them that, who think that Bitcoin's a progressive system because there's been a certain rhetoric around it. But when you strip away what people are imagining, it's a deeply conservative system. And of course, the core of the Bitcoin community. Sorry?
Why do you say that?
Well, because it views money as this constrained commodity that should be like held tight into essentially actually limited hands. Okay, but the strange thing about Bitcoin is it has this whole original ideology, or this original at least like rhetoric around democratizing money, and yet the actual system is designed to be highly constrictive, and the early adopters of that technology, or the early adopters of those tokens, are certainly concentrated in parts of the world that already have high levels of wealth. Yeah. Okay, and the subsequent fragmentation of the tokens to sort of like trickle into slightly more peripheral areas of the globe doesn't somehow make it any more progressive. It just means there's now people in the peripheries being slowly maybe pulled in to push up the price of the tokens for the early adopters. So it's definitely quite a regressive system. It's very rigid. It's very it's just very old school, and it's very crude. But it's highly technologically advanced in many ways. At least it's technologically innovative. So it had originally this illusion, or this kind of like sense, that it was somehow more advanced than other forms of money. I don't actually see Bitcoin as money at all, but this was the narrative originally.
You don't see Bitcoin as money?
No.
What do you see it as?
Bitcoin is basically, the way I would normally describe it is a blank tokens. That's my terminology. I don't know what other people would describe them as, but like basically the idea is it's digital objects. Okay, and that's pretty much the only thing that you can say about the objects in and of themselves. They also have a bunch of ancillary features you can speak about. You can move the object, you can break the object into pieces, you can, the object is hard to see. There's a bunch of things you can say about the movement and holdability of the object, but there's nothing about the object itself. All right, so this is the key element of like what I sometimes call it's featureless from the perspective of the actual token. The token itself is featureless, but then it has all these systems around it, which people are imagining will somehow imbue the token with some kind of like feature in itself. I'm trying to think of a metaphor for this, like. One of the metaphors I sometimes use is like a train system. So if I was an engineer building a train system, or like let's say I was like a government building a train system, I'd say I'd first build the actual trains and infrastructure and the depots and so on. I secondarily would then create a system for issuing tickets. All right. And thirdly, I might create a system to move the tickets between people. But the first two steps are much more important. You need the underlying actual, let's call it the real economy, like the actual things. Then there's a ticket layer, and then there's a transfer system for the tickets. In the Bitcoin system, what they've basically designed is an issuance system and a movement system, right? So, but the things that are being issued are, you might call them just blank tickets. There's nothing about the ticket that says anything about what its redeemability is, right? And the idea is, a lot of it in the crypto community, that if you can build this highly advanced ticket issuance and movement system, it will somehow reverse engineer the presence of a real economy, or the train system, as it were, if that metaphor makes sense.
Yeah, then Bitcoins aren't used very much for exchange anyway, are they? They're more for speculation.
No, but like I've spoken at Bitcoin conferences, for example, and all the talks are always about how can we move these things around more effectively, more securely, etc. All the discussion is around how do you move the thing? How do you do this in a more secure fashion? There's almost no discussion whatsoever about what is the thing that we are moving. How is it actually anchored into a real economy? There's almost like no consideration about that. And the dark secret of Bitcoin is that basically it isn't a form of money. It's basically a cyber collectible that you would use money to buy, and then you can resell for money.
Yeah.
And that's basically all there is to actually say about Bitcoin. But there's a whole sort of like narrative around it, which people will constantly like buy into. But the technology is very innovative. I mean, that's undeniable.
Yeah. So here's a biggie. What's wrong with the money system?
What's wrong with the money system? Well, I suppose there's some like, it depends on how deep you want me to go with this question. Like, there's sort of like smaller problems and then bigger problems, I guess. But let me give it a go. Well, like the first thing I would say is the way I think about things doesn't tend to be binary. Okay, I often see contradictions. I hold contradictions at the same time. So with money systems, mainstream large-scale state money systems, what I would often see is these are systems that have enabled extremely large-scale economies to form. Okay, like having these big issues of money that push out and then have this whole issuance process where they're issuing it out, pulling it back in, has basically, as it were, like created very large-scale economic networks. Now, and then you can just often refer to as like capitalism, right? This whole system of interlocking exchange and so on are underpinned by these huge monetary systems. So on the one hand, people's livelihoods do depend on these systems. you know, like small business owners and so on. Everybody is locked into these systems. And in our current way society is structured, we do depend upon these systems in the sense they form a lifeline to us. So there's a certain kind of like just reality to them. But they simultaneously create a lot of like, if I'm using like old school like Marxist terminology, I'll just say like alienation. Basically, people often can't see what's happening. Like they're stuck in these huge networks, which are created by money systems, but they can't often like see who has the power. They often like don't understand that like what's going on in these systems. They don't feel connected. They just see this world of just like free floating objects, and they have to try and find a job, and they feel like scared and confused and so on, right? And a lot of like, you know, a lot of alternative economy projects that try to do like localization, often what you're trying to do is to sort of bring that network to a smaller scale so a person can feel more like they know what's happening and they feel more in control. But simultaneously, it will kind of like lower the amount of things they can get, right? Because the whole thing about super large scale systems is that it means like there's lots of stuff.
Yeah.
So this is the whole like trade-off, I guess, with like monetary design stuff. Is it's like, okay, de facto reality is the state and the banking sector dominates the money system right now. On the one hand, you can try to build small scale alternatives, you know, often like what you're trying to do with mutual credit. Or you can try to go and make interventions through like, they say, political processes into like making sure that, for example, the central bank is under democratic control, making sure the banks are acting in the public interest. These are kind of more like large scale political interventions into the existing system. But yeah, that's a very like broad scale kind of thing. But like the sort of more specific problems that are associated with that type of system is like social inequality, environmental destruction, pervasive confusion of like what you're doing in an economy. Like I for example, teach sometimes students at like universities, and you see the confusion often in their eyes about like they've been told, I have to get a job in this huge invisible network that I can't see. I hope somebody's going to like offer me a job, but I have no idea where to find this thing that you're supposed to find, right? And so the whole way people like think about these systems is that like I'm this tiny little person trying to like understand invisible forces, and that's often what I'm trying to do sometimes is to try and like reveal what those invisible forces are, so people can be more like understand more what's happening around them.
So are you saying that the scale of the money system is just way beyond any natural human scale, so it works against human happiness? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, well, again, I have a contradiction based, or like let's say, I don't have like the duality necessarily. Like it's de facto how we are as human beings right now is based on modern monetary systems. You know, like we don't know what it's actually like to be a non-monetary society. We have no experience at all of what it means to have a non-monetary society. You have to go back to anthropology for that to understand the sort of pre-capitalist non-monetary societies. But like, sure, a lot of the sort of modern, these like issues that we have all stem from a lot of the sort of the scale of the system. And what you can argue, if you start to get very like meta about it, is to say that within the system, these networks that are underpinned by money systems, humans end up not actually being in control of their own world, because actually forces start to emerge which are not actually under the control of anybody, and they start to like almost feel, you know, Adam Smith used to call this like the invisible hand, right? You're pushed around by these forces, and he had a very positive take on that, right? There's this kind of like, this is supposed to create order, but actually for most people, this actually manifests in their life as just like a sense of like not being in control of anything and not understanding what's going on, and actually often disguising exploitation and like wealth accumulation by like very specific parts of the economy. Like,
do you think there could actually be a political solution to this? Because I mean, states are subject to these same forces, aren't they?
Exactly. The system is underpinned by the like the state and the banking sector cannot be extricated from the system. Yeah. You know, in libertarian circles, if you hang out with all the crypto people, they always believe that there's a separation between states and markets. They always have this like fantasy
Yeah,
that there's
yeah.
this like separation between these entities, and it's like there is no such thing as
That's
large
what
scale markets without
That's
these
the
systems.
argument
Right?
I have all the time. Yeah. So it's on the left, you say, "Oh, the state is going to solve this problem." It's like, but the state is part of the whole thing.
Yeah, and the whole thing about left-right politics is like, okay, you're trying to like one side might be like let's try to like wrestle the state to a position where it supports the sort of more peripheral parts of the system, the network, there's the ordinary workers, rather than the like large-scale like capitalists, right? Like, so this is, but there's this whole kind of like, you know, often when I'm doing, you know, sort of let's say like I enter into libertarian circles, I get these critiques, you know, people are like, oh, you know, you have statist tendencies and stuff, right? And I'm like, you know what's also statist? Statist is believing that your workers can get to work without being attacked. You know, like statist is believing that you're allowed to go bankrupt. You know, statism is like all these things that most modern capitalists just take for granted. You know, if like pre-capitalist societies, if you like go into debt and don't pay it back, you get killed. You know, like it's, well, like, I mean, not necessarily, but like these systems where like business owners expect to be protected from forces that are like, this is a state-based system. This is what you only find modern capitalism in the context of states.
Yeah. When I talk to people on the left, they see the state as a counterbalance to corporate power, and actually, so do people on the right. They see that, but they have different perspectives on that.
Yeah, I mean, basically all political positions right now assume the state, unless you're in proper like anarchist circles but the anarchist circles, you do find like anarchist tendencies in say the mutual credit type movements, these localist movements, because often what they're saying is we want to do a true form of decentralization in the sense we want to devolve power back down to a human scale. Sometimes localist movements romanticize this because if you actually do like anthropology of like small scale societies, they're not necessarily like peace loving kind of, you know, places. You're talking about people who are potentially, you know, old school systems are not necessarily romantic.
I forgot to mention that you're an anthropologist, aren't you?
Yeah. Like the proper anthropology of like gift economies and stuff will look at this. It's like, yes, actually pre-capitalist societies definitely do not operate anything like market exchange, all right? But there's all these other systems going on, like feud-based systems and so on. There's a lot of like dynamics to it, but like, again, there's trade-offs in it. It's like you're a lot more connected to your community, but you potentially have a lot less trust of outsiders. Whereas in super large-scale money systems, you don't know your neighbor, but you're happy to do business with somebody over Amazon who you've never seen before.
Yeah.
You know, like there's all these kind of like strange contradictions.
Well, I guess now we have the sort of the technology and the internet and the technology to federate local groups. And so that trust can be spread out further because, you know, other people you're dealing with are also in a trusted group. So
yeah, I mean, it's very exciting, actually, some of the new modern hybridized attempts at doing local, global mixtures and so on. So I'm like, it's very, very interesting.
Do you think that more people understand where money comes from now? I mean, I know Positive Money have done a lot of work, and but I also remember that they did a survey of politicians, and only 10% of them knew where money came from. And so, you know, it seems like a mystery. Do you think that's changing?
You know, it's actually, I think, okay, let's say in elite circles, or like, let's say your influencer circles, like journalists and your media types and your like sort of startup people and the kind of people who like hang out in cities and innovation salons. In general, in this group, it's become a bit more like, it'll be a faux pas, let's say, if you reveal that you don't actually understand like monetary, where some basic points about monetary systems. But I still think if you look at the school system, if you look at just like what people who are not involved in the sort of like intelligentsia type part of society, like this is not taught at all. There's no education around monetary systems. It's actually they use commodity based thinking of money. It's like, oh, in the beginning, money is a commodity and it's still sort of a commodity in some kind of way. Like, and that's how people think about it. I mean, I've seen children's books that they put out. Actually, a friend showed me a children's book recently that she's been using for her kids. And it has all these stories about, in the beginning, money was this barter, and then it was this, and then so they use all these old school things still in modern and children's books.
I've talked to people who work in the banking industry who they say, oh, banks lend out money that people save with them, and that's how it works. Okay.
Yeah, basically, the biggest thing I sometimes call like the one form of money, like error. There's this whole notion in society. People often have this like idea that there's this one form of money. There's just the British pound, and it just floats around, and it goes into the banks, and then the banks take it and they lend it out, and this one form is going around. And this whole idea of like actually there's separate forms. There's like a state layer to the money system, and then the banks are issuing out their own credits or chips, as it were. That forms the majority of the money supply. That's still very poorly understood in most of society. I'd say even in people who are doing money stuff and like banks, they don't even necessarily understand.
Yeah,